The COVID-19 pandemic forced many organizations to revisit their approach to investigations. In recent months, investigators have been dealing with challenges in identifying, preserving, and reviewing data, as well as holding remote interviews and collaborating from their homes. We have an expert panel here with us today to give practical observations based on their experience conducting remote investigations and to discuss implications for investigations in the future. So to get us started, I'll turn it over to Ben Cohen. Ben is Principal in Control Risks Compliance, Forensics, and Intelligence Practice in the Americas region. Ben, it's great to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you sit. Welcome to all the attendees. Yes, this is Ben Cohen, and I have the honor today of being your moderator for what should be an interesting and timely conversation on those challenges and lessons learned for investigative professionals as you adjust in your roles as a result of the pandemic. As Kelly said, I'm a principal in Control Risk Compliance, Forensics, and Intelligence Practice for the Americas region. My normal office location is in Washington, D.C. By way of further background, I'm a CPA, and I often lead on investigative matters that require technical accounting or internal controls expertise. Today, I'm joined by two control risk partners from the same practice, Michele Wiener from the Americas region and Michael Zimmern from EMEA. And I'll allow them to introduce themselves. Michele?
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everyone. As Ben noted, I'm a partner at Control Risk, located in the Americas region, which comprises Canada, the U.S., the Caribbean, and then both Central and South America. I had control risk, regulatory risk, and investigations practice for the region. I'm lucky to have Ben on my team here. That team, as Ben suggested, is comprised of a multidisciplinary group of forensic accountants, data analysts, former law enforcement, and then prosecutors. And like many of you, by way of background, I am an attorney. From an investigations perspective and relevant to the topic we're going to talk about today, most of our clients are multinational corporations, many of which are headquartered in the U.S., but some headquartered outside as well, that need assistance with internal corporate investigations kind of across the globe. And so those are both small internal matters and really straight through to really large regulatory matters in front of the DOJ, the SEC, the World Bank, IDB. And in those matters, outside counsels also typically engaged, and we'll talk a little bit about both of those types of matters during our discussion today. I'll turn it over to my partner, Michael.
Thanks, Michele. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon from London. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I lead the investigations team for Control Risk in EMEA. We work with clients on matters throughout Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Russia from our network of offices across the region. Like Michele and the Americas team, we support corporate clients as well as public sector organizations and NGOs with investigations into fraud and misconduct, including regulatory and reputational issues. Ben, over to you.
Thank you both. So in addition to the materials we've prepared for you today, we have been surveying and benchmarking our clients' perspectives, their concerns, and reactions during this pandemic, and we'll share with you what we've learned as part of our presentation today. As Kelly said, we'll also include some polling questions for the participants to help guide the conversation, and we welcome your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll try to cover some of them throughout the presentation as well as leave some time at the end for Q&A. So for today's agenda, we're actually using an abbreviated version of our materials for purposes of this presentation, but a full version of the materials will be available for all of the attendees to download at the completion of the presentation. And we do hope to cover today a few things: the types of issues we are seeing arise in an investigative context, the pivoting in approach that has been required as investigations are conducted virtually or remotely, and the lessons learned and some best practices, as it looks like we will continue to conduct these investigations remotely in the near to midterm. So, Michele, could you get us started on the current compliance risk picture based on our recent experience?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. I think it's important to kind of level set that all of our comments today, we've taken what we'll call a global perspective with the number of attendees we have and the diversity of the where you sit. Your investigations will vary because there's going to be nuances country by country that are going to be changed by both the level of access you have given current state of the pandemic. There'll be legal considerations that will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as well as cultural considerations. And we will try to cover all of those today through some case studies we have and some of our kind of real life experiences conducting investigations. But if you have specific jurisdiction specific questions, we will do our best to answer them across kind of Ben's experience and Michael's and mine as well. I think one of the themes that you will hear kind of repeatedly throughout our presentation today is adjustment. The pandemic has really required investigative teams to adjust at rapid pace from what was kind of a normal approach to conducting in-person interviews to really a large measure of conducting almost everything remotely, including how you collect and review documents, how you talk to people, straight through to your reporting out to stakeholders within your businesses. And we're going to try to cover across some of the challenges, but really provide you with some practical tips and tricks we've seen based on where the current environment is, where we stand right now. Michael, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that teams have had kind of as they move from more traditional investigative approaches to kind of pandemic remote investigative approaches?
Yeah, sure. So I think the last few months have been difficult for everyone, including for compliance and investigation teams, who have been dealing with an increasing risk profile at a time when some of the traditional investigation techniques have been impacted. The investigations have also been dealing with competing demands within the business to deal with urgent operational issues, with limited management time and with resource constraints, both impacting people and budgets. And we found that the organizations choosing to dedicate more time to investigations generally appear to be those who see addressing misconduct as a critical part of their business, and those who have built the best investigations and compliance infrastructure have been the most resilient and adaptable to the recent changes. So some of the common themes that we've observed, the ability to locate and access data remotely has really helped organizations continue to perform investigations. That often goes hand in hand with an existing capability to perform remote investigations, or indeed to conduct early case assessment work through analysis of remote data. We've also noticed that the structure of the team has had a big impact on how able teams have been to cope with the transition. So those with a globally distributed network of compliance professionals within the organization have been able to lean on them for local input, whereas those with the more centralized investigations function, I think, have had a harder job of transitioning to the new remote approach. Where there have been difficulties accessing data or documents, or where there's limited oversight of local teams, that's really made remote investigations more challenging, and we'll talk about some of the specifics that impact on those things as we go through the presentation. Ben, did you want to move on?
Michael, I think I'll pick up just in addition to kind of the keys to getting it right as you move to this virtual investigative posture. I think one of the other things that's interesting to think about and is on the slide is this surge in whistleblower claims that we've seen. And it's interesting from, I think, two perspectives. There are only really two types of companies in our experience, those that have experienced this surge and those that have not. And so it raises a question about why the reason for a surge in whistleblower claims. What is it about the pandemic that's potentially driving that? And some of what we've seen does have a direct nexus to the pandemic, but some of it is actually unrelated. And drawing that nexus to the why has not really been as straightforward as we would have thought. But one of the interesting things about it is that There does seem to be some industry-specific trends on whether or not you're receiving a surge in whistleblower claims. So businesses that have had to kind of continue essential operations have seen this at a higher level than those that have more corporate teams that are working from home or working remotely. So manufacturing, health systems, agriculture and food we've seen this uptick in claims coming in, which has resulted in larger caseloads for their investigative team. The other interesting nexus we see to the surge in whistleblower claims is whether or not your compliance team or even your executive team messaged out or reiterated at the beginning of the pandemic as people moved to working from home, whether they messaged the importance of compliance in a remote work environment, and specifically whether or not that messaging included reference to the hotline being a resource for your employees to raise concerns. One of the other things that we've thought about in terms of the nexus to this surge is just the fact that employees aren't interacting in the office every day. And so where concerns might be raised in the course of normal conversation, or you might seek out a manager to discuss something that's troubling you, without the ability to do that, it could be that the lack of that social interaction is actually encouraging and incentivizing employees to go to their hotline to raise concerns. So I think what this does raise for the participants and the attendees today is if your business hasn't experienced this surge, or you've seen even a decrease in activity, our clients are asking themselves whether that could be an indication that issues are going unreported and you will see a delayed surge in a rise in claims. And some of our clients have taken those additional steps, if they hadn't done it already, to help their employees by further socializing their hotline as a resource to ensure that issues and potential concerns are being raised up to the investigative teams. And it's really interesting if you look at the recent Department of Justice guidance on compliance programs, when they talk about changes, the most recent changes on the investigative piece of that guidance references kind of asking whether or not the company has taken measures to really test whether their employees are aware of the hotline and do they feel comfortable using it. And so given that guidance, I think looking at your trends in terms of what you're seeing in terms of number of claims coming through your hotline for investigative teams is well warranted. I think the other thing we wanted to talk about here is some of the new risks that we're seeing, the types of claims that are being raised. And we did get a question from one of our attendees kind of specific to what some of those claims are looking like when we talk about a surge. And some of them are directly related to the pandemic, the most obvious one being concerns raised about the use or non-use of personal protective equipment, or PPE. So health and safety concerns and claims being raised by employees, either employees that are violating social distancing measures, they're refusing to wear masks, they're coming to work when they're ill, or even the fact that they're not coming to work has raised a bunch of concerns given in the U.S. we've seen an uptick in those types of claims given really kind of high levels of unemployment available to employees that are not working in the U.S. in particular. One of the other kind of new risks that we saw just recently arise in the U.S. as well is around racial discrimination in response to the George Floyd protests in particular. And there had not been kind of a high level of those HR type claims in our experience in past history, given like current environment, those have increased as well. And there's also some other kinds of new claims that we've seen that are tangentially related to the pandemic, things like that are related also to kind of the remote working conditions that employees are in. It blurs that line between what is your home and what is your work, because the environment is the same, and it's things around cyber risk, use of personal devices. We've seen an uptick in investigations related to employee social media usage. They're at home and on social media perhaps more, and so we've seen that as a new or an increased risk area. And I think the challenge for investigative teams in particular, when you think about this, is twofold. One is company policies haven't always kept up with kind of some of the newness of the claims. And so when you're talking and looking during an investigation, one of the goals may be to determine whether or not there's been a violation of company policy. And without written policies that have been clearly communicated, that's a gap we've seen that investigative teams have been struggling with. And one of the other ones that I think is interesting to think about is how you triage these new risks as they come in. So clients, their taxonomies or the categories of the way their hotline claims are being managed has been impacted by these new risks as well. We see a lot of things getting bucketed into the category of other because there was no kind of specific personal protective equipment category. There may have been a more broad health and safety, but employees seem to be struggling with a bit about how to categorize when they're making hotline claims, how to categorize them, and for teams, how to also triage what level of investigation you have when it's coming in if you are, in fact, tiering your investigations. Those are some of the little behind-the-scene things that investigative teams should be considering, whether or not you need to make changes to your taxonomy, whether or not you're getting tiering right, given the fact that we are, in fact, we are seeing new types of risks being raised for investigative teams. And one of the other things, too, that I think... Go ahead, Ben.
I'm sorry, Michelle, and I just wanted to say it is interesting. I think the Speakup culture generally is as strong as it's ever been, and that could be a reason for the surge in claims, but that, this surge also makes it a challenge to triage all those additional claims.
Yeah, I think the level of comfort that employees have with actually raising claims is really, really high. We've seen that arise just generally, even pre-pandemic, on employees' comfort with raising concerns in kind of today's business environment. I think the other one that we would be remiss in not talking about, because it's interesting, is a real increase in what we'll call financial investigations as well. And we can't decide if this is because finance teams with business pressure and cost-cutting measures have been looking more closely at expenses and spend, and that has bubbled up some claims and more investigations on the financial side of things. But we have seen that as well, everything from payroll to fraud, waste, and abuse. And there is some interesting literature out there about kind of this current fraud risk environment. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit? I'll let the CPA give the perspective on kind of the fraud risk environment.
Thanks, Michelle. I think just picking up on your point, first of all, I think one of the things that happened over the last few months is we've seen an acceleration in a trend, certainly in EMEA, that we were seeing before the pandemic hit, around a broadening of the diversity of the kind of cases that require investigation. So beyond financial matters into broader conduct matters. And I think some of the things you've just described really just illustrate that continuing. And I guess part of the consideration for investigation teams is looking at new data sets and different sources of information in which to consider some of those claims, some of them conduct and behavior cases, and you can't resolve them with the same sources that may have been relevant for, say, a financial statement fraud. Just picking up on the fraud angle more, we thought it would be helpful to share the findings of a recent survey published by the ACFE, which had almost 2,000 respondents globally and really illustrates some of the themes that we've just been describing. So many respondents to the survey did not expect an additional funding or resource, but they did expect increased challenges investigating fraud. and they also expected to see an increase in fraud risk at the time and also within the next year, ranging across activities from cyber to financial statement fraud and corruption. And this is something I think we've already begun to see manifest itself, not just issues arising from the pandemic itself, but also historical issues emerging that were previously not known to organizations that have been highlighted due to the changing circumstances and maybe different ways of looking at information that's come through. Then I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So that takes us to our first polling question, which actually it looks backwards in time a bit to the start of the shutdown. And we wanted to get the audience's perspective on what they have seen over the past 4 months or so as far as the impact on investigations. And I'll leave this up for about a minute so you have time to answer. You can select one of these answers. So we wanted to get the audience's input and understand if you've had to postpone or cancel investigations, if you've continued but they've become increasingly challenging, or has there not been any impact at all? And while you are completing this, another thought, Michael, to your point about other specific fraud risk topics, I think we've also seen an uptick in conflicts of interest, as Michele mentioned earlier as well, where it's another area of specific risk that companies increasingly have to deal with. And, part of the way to deal with that is to conduct due diligence, either internal diligence or externally, which can also be a challenge. So there's a need to have local resources to conduct third-party due diligence as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been an issue for a long time, and it's quite a hard one to investigate because whilst there's a set of data that's owned within the company, we also find that a huge portion of the information that's relevant to conflict of interest cases sits outside of the organization. It is beyond the limits of what they can reach. And so we do need to draw on other sources and other materials to complement the investigation. And as you say, having access to those local sources and local contexts is very important. And this is another area which has been challenged somewhat over the last few months, not just from an access point of view, but in the limitations of the inquiries that can be made.
Yeah, absolutely. And here are the current results, which are interesting. I think, as expected, investigations have become more challenging as the majority answer here. But there is a fair amount, about a quarter of respondents have had to postpone or cancel investigations altogether. So there has been a large impact based on the nature of investigations being conducted remotely. And now with our second polling questions, we'll talk about moving forward and putting best practices into action. So again, we're limiting the answer here to one, although several of these may apply as far as challenges or difficulties that you have seen as far as conducting your investigation. And as you can see, we've talked about some of these challenges as far as interviews, data integrity, privileged information, when to actually conduct remote investigations, which might vary by jurisdiction, and as well as training. So I'll give everybody a minute here to complete this as well.
And now might actually be a good time to go ahead and read out the SAILI code for today's event. So the SAILI code for today is AHEAD 29. That's AHEAD and the number 29 with no spaces. Again, the SAILI code for today's webcast is AHEAD 29.
Thanks, Kelly. So here are the results, and it does look like that conducting remote interviews effectively is by far and away the largest challenge that people have seen. Second is actually a tie between data integrity in remote document collection and clear protocols as to when to conduct traditionally versus remote. So we will be sure to cover the interview topic in more detail and also get into some of the data integrity and collection issues, as well as when it makes sense to actually conduct traditional versus remote and what are the benefits of each. So as we think about some of the challenges in the investigative life cycle, one thing that has really not changed is that the core investigative steps still need to be undertaken, but the process and the timeline need to be adapted. The approach may change, but the steps that you need to conduct really remain the same. And we think that the largest or most significant impact really come into steps 2 and 3, the planning and execution phases. So Michael and Michele, could we hear from each of you about what you have experienced as the primary changes required across this life cycle in terms of the most challenging and what adjustments are needed? Michael, perhaps you could start with the triage and planning phase.
Thanks, Ben. So I guess a few positives to start with. The first is that we still see clients deciding what to investigate based on the facts of the case or the merits of the case rather than concerns about practicalities. And I think we were probably more concerned at the outset of lockdown that practicalities would be the driving force behind decision making, but that's not something we've generally observed. And we've also seen clients spend more time on planning, which has been a good thing, thinking through what resources they have locally, how to access documents, and how to sequence the case. I think one of the big challenges around remote investigations has been sequencing of the different investigation steps rather than the totality of the investigation itself, with regards to things like people being available for interview or making inquiries for third parties and so on that are sometimes delayed. I think it's important, therefore, when scoping the case and also deciding on the approach, to think about what's reasonable, proportionate in the case and what's really required in order to conclude on the investigation, and also to document those considerations and any limitations, practical limitations that relate to the decisions that were made. Moving to collection, a lot of the considerations around collection are similar, but they've been exacerbated by some of the challenges around remote working. And just thinking about different kinds of data sources, beginning with hard copy data sources, it's obviously a huge logistical challenge trying to preserve documents remotely. It's harder to identify missing data sources remotely, and it's also harder to check authenticity of documents, particularly if they're paper documents that have been scanned. We found there's also unusual risk to loss and damage of documents that arise out of lockdown, particularly environmental factors, whether that's damage by environment within the office or animals or what have you. One benefit has been that in some cases office closure has given some comfort over the retention of documentation. Thinking around third-party data, we've noticed there's been some delays accessing corporate registration information in countries where corporate registries have either been closed or have had limited working time, and there's been slower information feeding through from them. And we've also had challenges around interacting with third parties, particularly due to difficulties visiting sites and premises. Although I would say that in general, we've not really noticed many third parties hiding behind lockdown or COVID as an excuse to not cooperate. It's more been that some entities have just been hit incredibly hard and really struggled to provide the level of attention or data that's required. And we're going to speak in more detail about electronic data in a short while, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that now. Just worth flagging that there's obviously been a change in communication habits, and there are also significant challenges accessing mobile data, mobile devices. And both of those things need to be factored into the planning stage. And then finally, just thinking about data collection approach, there's a few factors that I would say is always worth considering. The first of those is privilege and the impact of privilege on work planning. And we would always encourage checking in with counsel on this. Obviously, privilege varies by jurisdiction. Likewise, data privacy and the need to be aware of local laws and restrictions around that. And finally, one other consideration we've noticed through lockdown has been around what to do with the data access of subjects or suspects to cases. And in a remote working environment, some activities around the behavior of the subject and also their access can be harder to control. It's harder to confiscate devices, for example. So it's worth thinking through access permissions, access to sensitive company data, and the practicalities of how you will actually go and recover devices and limit access in situations where there might be concern around what a subject might do. And now I'll hand over, Michele, for you to talk through some more detail on interviews and other matters of execution.
Michael, I think the point you made about ability to collect documents in hard copy, we often think about collection of hard copy documents. I think one of the trends we've seen, and might be interested whether or not you agree, one of the trends we've seen is that so many of our clients have already moved to having electronic versions of supporting materials available, whether they're uploading them into SAP or an employee expense system. So I feel like they've done better on collecting documents. Protocols were already in place for kind of reviewing emails generally. Whether or not you've seen that piece of the puzzle progress in a better way than you would have thought.
In relation to the hard copy documents being loaded up, I think it really depends on the jurisdiction and the maturity of the companies involved. In some of the emerging markets we work with, companies have a real range of capability depending on the particular location of the office or the site. And you will find there's some uptake of what I would call very sophisticated systems, including potentially accounting systems. But then there is still use of more traditional record-keeping systems. And so I think reliance just on the electronic network of the company often misses some documents that can be quite important if you're looking at a local operating environment. But that does vary from organization to organization. You're right.
I think you're right. And one of the other things that I think has been challenging too, that I'll just add, and then I'm going to move to interviews since so many of our attendees are struggling with that kind of piece of the puzzle, and the challenges there have been probably at the highest volume in terms of conducting investigations remotely, is walkthroughs. And I think this is an interesting one. So if there's been an allegation in an investigation that there's been some type of control gap from a root cause analysis, or you've got, in fact, an override, a purposeful override of some type of control, whether it's a systems control or a manual control, we would typically, within an investigation, perform walkthroughs of the systems and the usage. And I think that has been a particular challenge, equally kind of impacted by availability of systems kind of in the office and people in the office, which is where those would normally take place. I don't think I have thought that much about interviews was the clear place where in-person access was going to impact in the investigations. But on walkthroughs, that's been another area that I think has really been required us to think outside the box about how to address it, including things like doing walkthroughs through a shared screen platform. So I think there are ways to do them, but it has been another area that's been incredibly challenging as well. I'm going to
Michele, that's an interesting point. Just quickly on that, Michele, it's an interesting point because a lot of companies in the U.S., when they have returned to work, are on sort of an A and B schedule. And I think that may apply globally as well for some people returning to work. And that could impact segregation of duties and some other internal controls that typically would be in place if the full staff was in the office. So it is another challenge.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the segregation of duties part. You're right, Ben, to, as teams, even as you have some employees not working, employees on furlough or off on a reduced work week, as well as cost-cutting measures, those could have a corresponding impact on some key controls you have that should be considered when you're thinking about looking at controls in the context of an investigation as well. Given time, I'm going to move us to interviewing, and I think this probably more so than any other topic, we could spend a whole webinar, an entire hour on this topic in particular. I think that from a high level, all the best practices approach that you would typically take in planning and conducting interviews, really, they do remain. So, determining who's going to actually lead on the interview, how many interviewers are going to be needed, will you need translation, collecting and preparing your documents that you need to show the interview. Those are all steps that will still need to be taken. But this is also the area, I think, where the most unplanned circumstances have cropped up, and it has required even some on-the-fly adjustments as we've worked with our clients through some of these issues, and we'll talk a little bit, I think, about what we've learned. But if I've learned one thing, I think that one thing I've learned is that stuff's going to happen that you won't have planned for, but what's really important is establishing at a baseline in advance kind of what do you need to obtain a defensible interview record. That is the most critical point of really conducting interviews. And so there's some things that are going to happen that will maybe take you off of what your plan was going to be, but I think you need to come back to the question about what is the impact going to be on your ability to collect the information you need, and to be able to, it also underscores the need to document your process and what happens during an interview as well. So let's walk through just a couple of these, and we'll gladly take some questions then too if you have them. But before an interview, you would typically plan where you would conduct the interview, and that location has been largely taken off the table. Although I think in current state, we might be more in a hybrid model as Asia Pac in particular starts to open up. We have conducted some in-office interviews where the only individuals in our office, if you haven't gone to return to work, and you could do this if you have office access in places where you have freedom of movement as well, where the only individuals in the office have been the interviewee and the interviewers in a large conference room, maintaining social distancing, wearing masks to the extent that's necessary or is required. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out the ability in current pandemic environment to conduct some measure of in-person interviews. But I think most of our clients have migrated to conducting them remotely. And so the kind of threshold question is, are you going to conduct them on the telephone, or are you going to conduct video interviews? And I really think that you can't plan or think through your advanced communication to the person that's going to be interviewed too much. In this case, we've experienced on some interviews recently just talking about unexpected circumstances where the interviewee was in their car during the interview, or they were outside walking around during an interview. And so clearly communicating the fact that it is an interview, that you want them to be in a private location, that what format you would prefer to use. So are you going to plan to be on video, or are you going to just use an audio call? And the circumstances for wanting one or the other can differ, I think, very much so, depending on the reason why you're conducting the interview. So is it admission-seeking interview or an information-seeking interview, you may want to change whether or not you're using telephone or video. The other thing I think that needs to be carefully considered is, from an interviewer standpoint, like how many people? One of the things we've seen is because we're doing these remotely or on the phone, we've had a desire for there to be 3 or 4 or more people from the company side involved in interviews. And those become more like routine business calls, which may be fine for an information-seeking interview. But certainly I would recommend that you think through the actual number of people and getting the balance right, just as you would on an in-person interview too. You may also experience some surprises. We've seen this too from the who's going to attend from the interviewee side. We've had kids participate in interviews. We've had spouses, particularly and purposefully being with their spouse during the conduct of an interview, and you have to decide kind of whether or not that's something you're comfortable with, kind of from that, will it impact your ability to get a defensible interview record? We've also seen other employees joining interviews because someone's forwarded an invite as well. And so I think thinking through and clearly communicating expectations with the interviewee up front is going to be critical to having the interview go as much as possible as planned. You also need to think about what you're going to do if your interviewee doesn't want to be on video. That's not something that we've seen any corporate clients force, but it certainly is very, very helpful, particularly in sensitive HR investigations, to be able to assess stress on the interviewee, to assess honesty, truthfulness, cooperation. Video allows you to do that, not in the same way that an in-person interview would, but certainly you get a better measure of that. And even things, there's all kinds of tricky things that you might need to also consider up front. In the U.S., we give kind of standard upjohn warnings, so standard discussion about the company and the attorney conducting the interview not being their counsel. We've had to add to those warnings at the beginning information about things like, we're not recording the interview, and we would ask that you not record the interview as well. More upfront discussion of expectations of confidentiality in terms of not texting your employees for information during the interview. Or if we provide you documents, considering and thinking through what type of header information you need on those documents, confidential, used for use during the interview only. Because if you're going to provide documents to the interviewee, you want to be able to secure to the extent possible the confidentiality of those documents within the context of the interview as well. So it's really, there's the planning piece of this, I think, can't be underscored, and also documenting what happens during the interview, because when things go unplanned, documenting your approach, how you handled it during the context of the interview, I think is really important in case there's ever a hindsight look back on what happened during the interview as well. And even with the document binders, we've seen multiple approaches that you can take. It's kind of figuring out what's going to work best for you in the context of the nature of the interview. We've seen binders prepared of documents and sent to interviewees ahead of time, so they had time to review them and think about them in the context of an information-seeking interview. We've had real-time sending of documents to interviewees, so emails coming in as you're interviewing them. They're reviewing the emails or the documents you've given them real-time. And all of that, the planning piece of it that I'm going to come back to is interviews are going to take much longer in this remote context than you would expect. And we've seen the first thing we got wrong, and we got this wrong as well, was an assumption that a basic information-seeking interview on 1 or 2 topics, an hour should be more than enough time. But with breaks, and communication of documents and longer upfront warnings, everything has taken an additional measure of time as well here on interviews in particular. I'm going to stop there. Go ahead, Ben.
No, thanks, Michelle. Those are all really great points, and there's a lot to think about. I think in the interest of time, we'll move forward and talk through the essential role of technology, and wanted to hear from you and Michael as well on what technology solutions you've seen that have been employed to overcome some of the challenges that we've talked about with remote investigation.
I'll get us started. Then I think this has been an area where we've seen a lot of innovation, a lot of creative thinking outside the box, just like you're thinking on your feet when things go wrong in an interview. How to obtain and collect information has required some thinking outside the box as well. One of the things for kind of anyone on the phone and on the webinar that has kind of a U.S. nexus from a regulatory perspective, the U.S. regulators, the SEC, the DOJ, they have increased their capabilities in terms of technology, both in collecting data as well as data analytics. And so I think this is an area warranting thinking through how to up your game. You might not want to necessarily have to do that in the course of the pandemic, but it is an area where some creativity has allowed us to continue to collect and obtain information during the pandemic. And I'll actually use a case study just to quickly walk through a couple of points. Thinking about collecting data in particular, which has been one of the biggest challenges for our clients as businesses shut down. And we have done some unique things. We had a case, it was a company headquartered on the Western European continent that had a problem in one of their Asia-Pac operations, and it happened right as Asia-Pac was really shutting down, and we needed to collect. And so, unfortunately, we didn't have in-country kits to do forensic collection, and so we had resources on the ground in the country, and so getting a kit in country. So the mail systems haven't stopped, so that's been one good benefit to collections. So we were able to get kits in country. And if you have resources on the ground, our collection experts were actually able to work with resources on the ground that didn't necessarily, you need to have a minimum level of technical expertise, but you don't need to be an expert forensic collector necessarily. We were able to actually collect from mobile devices as well as laptops. And some of that has been thinking through and innovating how to actually collect over the network, how to leverage cloud access. And one of the keys, I think, to getting this right, before we talk a little bit about analytics and the benefit of those, I think is making sure you understand and have support from your own internal IT teams as well, because they can really help you navigate what your current policies are that would allow you to access over a network connection, for example, access laptops that are plugged into the network, access server data. And one of the other kind of innovative things that I've seen done as well is where we've been assisting clients, they let us, which pre-pandemic they might not have had as much appetite for, but they've let us go kind of behind the corporate wall. So given us direct access to their systems to be able to help us facilitate collecting direct from systems, whether that's financial ERPs or server backup data. Those are all kind of some of the unique approaches that we've seen taken. And all of those, we took all of those on this particular matter to be able to collect over the network, some in-person kit collections where people brought their laptops to public locations to be collected for collection, to working with IT, to behind the wall kind of access. There's ways to get the data from a tech perspective where the technology can really support you in getting that done. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about the data analytics piece?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Just very quickly, a few observations. One is, I think, across the region, we've seen the circumstances of the pandemic really act as a catalyst to teams engaging with different technology in order to facilitate investigations. And that's really helped with things like the evidential trail in regards to some documentation and being able to use the same team to look at matters in multiple geographies at the same time, because we now have a kind of coordinated way of seeing the data come through. In relation to analytics, clearly an important and fundamental part of investigation and compliance monitoring. I think one observation is that the analytics is also needed to adapt to the changing business circumstances. Some of the models that have been built struggle to work if all of the baseline assumptions have changed and for example, the budgeting and the thresholds have changed due to circumstance. So I think while there is a reliance on analytics, it's important for people to go back and test those assumptions and make sure they still hold true. And Ben, I'm conscious of time. I'll hand back to you.
Yes, thanks, Michael. So I think if we just move forward and look to the future quickly, and then we can leave a few minutes for questions as well. But, against regulators' expectations, there really isn't a pandemic defense for not conducting investigations. So we do need to continue conducting them. And I think, Michael, you covered some of the trends in analytics as far as looking to the future. And we've included here in your materials that you'll be able to download also some of the quotes and things that are being said by regulators globally to get an understanding of their point of view. So I think we should, just in the interest of time, move to questions. We received several questions on data privacy concerns. And I think people are interested in how companies ensure that those concerns are addressed during a remote investigation. Michael, perhaps you could cover that question.
Thanks, Ben. So just looking at it from a European context in relation to GDPR, I think one thing to say is that I've not seen the new regulations really negatively impact investigations, but it's very important to consider the GDPR guidance during planning and execution. And legitimate interest can still be grounds to obtain and review data, but it's important that the approach is transparent and proportionate. And so, again, as we've said in relation to other things, decisions are documented appropriately, and that you can demonstrate your investigative steps were targeted at the specifics of the case, and really do your best to avoid personal or sensitive information wherever possible. For example, there's very few investigations that I've done in recent times where it's been essential to look at picture files on a computer. So consider what data you really need to carry out the case. And I think in relation to data privacy, the final comment I'd make is that it's important to have the right infrastructure in place to process and review data in appropriate jurisdictions. And that's also something that should be considered during the scoping of the case.
Michael, I'll add one point to that too, because I think on the cloud access, that's caused some what I'll call heartburn. So in terms of understanding when you're using cloud access, where the data is kind of residing, that's been something that our clients have had to really think about in terms of, particularly with the EU data privacy, making sure that they've gone actually to more traditional collections sometimes in those cases to make sure that instead of using a cloud repository, they're actually using like a data center that's located within the EU for EU materials to make sure that there's no questions about having violated data privacy because there's some type of repository cloud access being used as well. I don't know if you've seen that similarly.
Yeah, that's quite right. It's quite important, as I say, to have the capability in place to capture and process and review the data in the right locations. And you're quite right, moving data across borders is something that needs to be thought about very carefully before it's done.
And the other one is that I would just add to the list is when you're using secure FTPs, so file transfer protocols, all of those secure FTPs, the data actually resides somewhere as well. And so you need to think about where you need to set up your SFTP too. The matter that I talked about in Asia Pac, we actually had to set up multiple SFTPs to make sure that we weren't violating and we're keeping mindful of both data blocking statutes, keeping stuff in Asia Pac, keeping stuff within the European continent and within the U.S. as well, since we were collecting across 3 different jurisdictions. Just another lesson that we learned kind of early in the pandemic days.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks both. And we probably have time for one more question. We received, not surprisingly, a few questions on interviewing. Michele, I'm curious what your thoughts are. A few respondents asked about how to evaluate an interviewee's credibility and how to build rapport with interviewees in this environment.
Yeah, it is impacted. I think video helps in terms of, so most of the ability to assess honesty, stress, in an interview is when you're doing it in person, it's visual cues, very much so. Everything from a person's propensity to cover or touch their mouth, their eye movements. And so most of those training around those visual cues, doing that in person is much easier in a controlled environment as well. It's much harder even on video. It's nearly impossible on the phone. And so that is going to be a limitation of the phone interview too. So when you get closer to an admission-seeking interview, we have tried to conduct those on video to the extent that we're able. The other circumstance where I think video is really, really helpful is in a sensitive HR investigation, because when you have what I will call kind of a victim interview, being able to assess how stressed the interviewee is, to make sure that you're giving them appropriate breaks. Video really helps with that. And Michael and I had an interesting conversation about the rapport issue. I think we had we learn from one another all the time too as we're going through this. Been a bit of a disagreement about whether or not you need to develop rapport at the beginning of an interview. And I think it once again comes back to the nature of the interview. In terms of developing a rapport, certainly on a fact-finding interview where you're really wanting to get, a high level of cooperation, your information seeking, it's easier to kind of develop rapport than it would be on a more contentious or difficult interviewee with a potential perpetrator. And on those, I'm not sure that developing rapport over the phone it's possible to actually get there. I've given up a bit on trying to develop rapport in that type of interview. I think Michael's much nicer than me. He suggested that he's still trying to build rapport at the beginning of those interviews.
And thanks, and Michele and Michael. Unfortunately, we're at our time. I know we could talk through this at length for probably an entire day, but we wanted to thank everyone for attending today. Hopefully, it's been informative. Michele, Michael, and I really appreciate your time.